So, John said, let's practice real love. It's been said by quite a few New Testament scholars that they think that the letters of John, these epistles towards the end of the Christian scriptures, were actually commentaries, kind of mini commentaries of his gospel, that he'd given them the gospel and then he thought, maybe they don't know what I meant by that. And so he went back and wrote some more to clarify things. And he probably felt the need to clarify just because the state the church was in. I mean, this is the time after the resurrection and the ascension. The Christian community is small. It's surrounded by people who don't agree with them, both Romans and Greeks and Jews. So they were a small community, and they felt unsafe, and small, unsafe communities tend to get on each other's nerves. And they were fractious and divided. And John wants to write to them about what he thinks is the most important thing for them to understand. So he talks about love. In fact, in 1 John alone, it appears 35 times. And that's more than in the whole of the Epistle of Romans. It's more than even 1 Corinthians, that has that lovely chapter 13, love is patient and kind, love bears all things. More than that. In fact, in John's Gospel, he uses the word love more than Matthew, Mark, and Luke do together. So this is his hobby horse in the Christian faith, love. And I think we should clarify what love is not first. Okay. Love is not a bare-chested man with long flowing locks on the cover of a Harlequin romance novel. I was interim minister at a Presbyterian church for 1 year, and one of their previous staff associates wrote Regency romances. I knew nothing about such things because I never read them. And I went to visit her because I needed to know a little bit more about the congregation. And as I was getting ready to leave, she said, "Oh, would you like one of my books?" And I said, "Well, sure, you know." And it was one of those books. And I took it home and I tossed it on my daughter's bed. I said, "Oh, you know, the lady from the church wrote this." And thought nothing of it. And that evening, I'm lying in bed reading my murder mystery. And I hear a tap, tap, tap on my door. And I said, "Well, come in." And Erin says, "Mom, I don't think you want me to read this." So, you know, not wanting to be a parent who censors their children, I read the book. And one description of the lead male character in the book was he had legs of alabaster. Well, this woman's husband was my choir director. And as he walked from the loft to the grand piano, I kept looking and wondering, is this the inspiration? But we're not talking about that kind of love in John. It's not that romantic, sentimental, soft, dreamy stuff. The love John's talking about is entirely different. It is bold, outspoken, courageous, and it's eminently practical. This love that John talks about is engaged in everyday life. It's not separated from. It's about real living. And reading this passage took me back to when I was, I think, probably 10 or 11, and many of you may have remembered this. I was, after church, they had coffee hour in the ladies' parlor at Melrose, and I was running around with all the other kids. And this was at the time that the United Church had begun one of those new national study programs. And it was called Live Love. Any of you remember it? I tried to find the logo for it, and it's nowhere to be found on the internet. So and I was in Sunday school, so I didn't hear the sermon about what live, love meant. But there I was running around the ladies' parlor, and I overheard one woman say to another, "Live, love, what on earth does that mean? It's so silly, it's stupid, it means nothing." It's funny the things you remember. Well, I hope I do a better job than the one she got on this one, but here we go. What does living love look like? Because that's what John said. This is the core of being a Christian, is to live real, practical love. And to begin, he said, if you want to know how to do this, just keep in mind the sacrifice of Jesus. Imagine, if you can hold in your heads when you're trying to live love, Jesus on the cross. Not the bare cross that we Protestants like, but let's go with the cross that the Roman Catholics use, with Jesus on it. What does that mean? The sacrificial love of Jesus was risky. He took every risk in the book, and so it's courageous. It was faithful to God even unto death, and it was concrete. That's the whole point of Jesus. Jesus was God incarnate, made flesh and blood like us. This is real death, real tragedy, and then real miracle and wonder. And the Jesus we see on the cross is bold and daring. And the sacrifice of Jesus was not for Jesus, it was for everybody else, us. So sacrificial love is more about others than about self. And these words are hardly out of John's mouth or off his pen when he says, I know you're going to say, I'm not good enough for that. I will make a mess of this stuff. Don't pick me. And to that he says, God will love us no matter what we do or how we do it. And then, right at the end of the passage, John offers the pièce de résistance. As we're deciding that we can't really do this live-love thing very well, and he says, and you're going to have the Holy Spirit to guide you, to help you figure out. Always with us. Now, today, as many of you know, is Earth Day. And typically, on Earth Day, we would focus on the natural environment. But I want to invite you to think about your earth caring today of the built environment, of what this means as we consider it through the filter of this call to practice real love. Well, you already know a bit of my story of my grandparents, but I'll tell you a little bit more. So Grandpa came here in 2003, and Grandma came in actually 2005. 19. Oh, God. I always worry about timid Christians who never speak up. That and the days gone by when there was such respect for clergy. Okay, 1903, Grandpa came. 1905, Grandma came, and they got married. And in 1921, they moved into their brand spanking new house on Charlton Avenue in Hamilton. My grandfather was a carpenter, and he rose in Piggott Construction to become their chief superintendent. And when I want to know my grandfather better, all I have to do is drive around southern Ontario and look at the buildings he built. If you've ever been to Niagara Falls, been to the tea room, Grandpa built that. The Sir Harry Oakes estate, he built that. And then my mother's older brother succeeded his father as chief superintendent and built most of the skyscrapers in Toronto and all of the GM plant in Oshawa and so much more. So that man built this house for my grandmother with inlaid hardwood floors, dark and light oak. and beautiful, deep, beautiful oak pocket doors between the living room and dining room with leaded stained glass window. And a beautiful fireplace in the living room, when you had a fireplace in the living room instead of a big TV as the focal point. He built it with tremendous skill and sacrifice because he was building it while he was working, so he was doing it at night and on the weekends when he was in town. But most of all, he built it with love. And it was a gorgeous home. And although I never knew my grandparents, I got to grow up in that home too. And about 15 years ago, after Mom and Dad had sold the house, I was back in Hamilton on a visit and was driving around, and they had sold it. This is convoluted, so they sold it to the children of friends of theirs. Okay? So they didn't really know this couple, but they knew they had their parents had mutual friends with my parents. So I was driving around Hamilton on a visit, and I found myself on Charlton Avenue, and I stopped, and I was looking at the house. And I decided I would just knock on the door. And the woman opened. I said, "Hi, I grew up in this house. Can I look around, please?" And she just opened the door. And in I went. Now, my parents were many things, loving, wonderful, wise people, but they could not decorate to save their life. They had put dusty rose wall-to-wall carpet in that went with the green drapery, I think celery green. It had an avocado bathroom with orange and avocado wallpaper. They put an island in a kitchen that never should have had an island. So I went in to see what this couple had done. And it was like being shown somebody's treasure. This woman opened the door to reveal the hardwood floors everywhere. She said, we took up all the carpets and we refinished the floors. They're beautiful. And she stepped into the living room and she said, we uncovered the fireplace. And we've refinished the pocket doors, and we had somebody rebuild the light fixture that was here in the dining room so it works perfectly again. And we took out the cabinetry your parents put in the kitchen. I hope you like it. And of course it was just like it was when I was growing up. And I went in my old room, and the Snow White and Seven Dwarfs wallpaper is finally gone. And then they took me up to the third floor. So up until that point, they had restored the original beauty of the house. And on the third floor of the house, which was half attic for storage and the other half was a bedroom for my oldest brothers, and in between were the big closets where winter clothes went during the summer and that kind of thing. So we went up to the third floor and opened up to their dream. They built a master suite with skylights and a beautiful glass block washroom in the middle. It was gorgeous. And she took me back downstairs after that. And we came through the other way into the dining room because there were two doors. And she said, "Oh, and this is the last thing you should see." And there, hanging in a place of honor, is a picture of my grandfather. I haven't been back to the house since, but that's okay. Because I know that the people who live in it now love that place as much as I do, as much as my mom and dad do, as much as my grandparents did, my grandfather in building it, and my grandmother in never saying to her husband, "I wish you'd made every wall 1 foot bigger," which apparently she told my mother but never told him. This young couple are faithful stewards of that place. And being a faithful steward of the places God gives us is one of the most profound ways we are called to practice real love. Now, being a steward of places can certainly be uncomfortable, and it can generate much stress and divisions, especially in congregations. There's no doubt about it. And yet we sit here today in this magnificent sanctuary, and it is magnificent. Imagine what it must have been like 110 years ago in this little settlers' community. Before highways, when there was the ferry going across the road or across the lake, before there were dozens of flights in and out of town, 110 years old, a group of people determined to build this church, not for themselves, for their children and their grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And that's turned out to be for you and me. It must have seemed a ridiculously foolish enterprise at the time. It would be impossible for that small group of people to build something this grand. And then, if that hadn't been enough of a challenge for them, 90 years ago, so some 20 years later, they looked at their community and said, we need a place for our children and youth to play. We need a place where we can gather as a community for fellowship and learning and to eat and to share. And they built the hall. Could they afford it? I bet not. They could have waited for the Anglicans to build a hall, or the Roman Catholics. They could have waited until the school divisions decided it was time to start putting gymnasiums in the schools. But they didn't wait for somebody else. They forged ahead boldly, faithfully, out of love. As stewards, we manage the places God gives us. And we're guided by that call to do that stewardship with a bold, courageous love. It's not foolhardy. It's not putting your head in the sand. But it's courageous. We do it because it was bequeathed to us by our forebears in this community. They believed, and they built. They built because they believed that this community needed a place for them to gather. Big enough, not just for them, but for those who would come. They were determined that there would be a safe and welcoming place for children here. A place to build community. A place where relationships could be forged. And that brings us to now. We are the guardians and stewards of this place today. And we are called to live that same love that John spoke of to those Christians in the first century who wondered how they'd ever manage, who wondered how they would live in the face of the opposition around them. We're called to live our Christian love out loud with that image of Christ on the cross imprinted right in the middle of our minds to lead us forward. And how we live out our Christian love will determine what we do as stewards of this place. It can be a bold statement of faith for our children and grandchildren, and for the strangers who will be drawn here long into the future. There is a lovely Greek proverb that I give you to ponder today and into the future. It says, "A society grows great when old men plant trees whose shade they will never sit in." This is love, filled with power, with hope, and with the grace of the Holy Spirit. May it be in us always. This place is our treasure. Amen.